Hey, greetings. My name is Bud Houston. I serve Joshua Project as the director of People Group Data. Thanks for the opportunity to let me just share with you some things that I've learned about engaging unreached people groups in the diaspora. Uh, Before joining Joshua Project, I served a ministry called Global Gates, and Global Gates was focused on reaching the ends of the earth through global gateway cities. So I was a field missionary, served as the director of research, learning who and where people are and how God is using the diaspora to glorify his name. I also served as affinity leader for Middle East, North Africa, looking at seeing Arabs, Kurds, and Berbers globally engage with the gospel. Many times that was happening through urban centers in the West and in the East. My role currently with Joshua Project is a continuation of that, just saying, what's the remaining task and what are creative ways that we can mobilize the body of Christ to the greatest need. So a little bit about myself. Married, have 6 kids, live in Dallas, Texas, came to faith at age 26, and really just since then have committed to seeing God glorified among the nations. And so again, thanks for letting me share with you. I hope this is impactful in how you decide to allocate resources and mobilize churches to the glory of God among the nations. Let's jump in. Throughout history, people have been on the move, driven by the search for new opportunities, fleeing conflicts and disasters, or simply seeking a better life. And North America has become a key destination for these migrants, presenting a unique opportunity for the church in the West to reach the unreached. So, at this point in history, more people than ever are migrating. The UN reports that 281 million people are currently in the diaspora. US Census Bureau estimates the US is home to more immigrants than any other country, more than 45 million. The North America as a continent has more immigrants per total population than any other region in the world. 14.5% of the total population in North America are migrants. So, with human migration, the church in North America must ask what God's doing and position herself to respond. She must actively understand who's migrating, where they're going, and how that affects the church's mission. So, before we address that, let's look backwards and ask the question what God has been doing through history. Migration has been woven into the fabric of humanity's story since the dawn of creation. God's first command to Adam and Eve was to multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And so he was setting the stage for people to have this dynamic, globe spanning human race. And throughout the biblical narrative, we see stories of displacement that's often the cause or the resulted from sin or disaster, but ultimately it served God's purpose to further his redemptive plan. So let's just quickly go through these to set just what is God doing today by looking backward. Adam and Eve, start there. They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because of sin, but what was happening was he was moving people for his glory. We don't have to go very far, and we see the effects of sin. Cain murders Abel, and Cain is set into exile, but he is given a little bit of grace in a sense of a mark so that people would not kill him. So we see this picture of sin, people on the move, and grace. The scattering of people at Babel. Why? Because they were trying to build a tower to themselves. They were not obeying the command to fill the earth and subdue it. They were trying to make a name for themselves. Then we have Abram show up. The best we can tell, it's not a result of sin, but just truly God's grace that God called Abram out of Ur, ultimately to the place he would show him. Why? To be a blessing to the nations. Then we see Joseph's slavery led into Egypt. Why? Ultimately for Israel's salvation, a picture of Christ's coming. Then we see Ruth and Naomi. Because of famine, we see that Jesus' lineage is shaped through Boaz to the root of Jesse, to King David as a forerunner to Christ. We see even Christ being on the move into Egypt and then out of Egypt. And then the church is birthed, and the church then is dispersed, spreading the gospel, seeing the church in Antioch planted, which has changed the history of the world. So, what is God doing? Part of God's redemptive plan is people on the move. And what we can say is why? Why would God do that? Well, the Apostle Paul makes that very clear is when people are on the move, God is at work. If you want to see God at work, look for people on the move. Paul tells us this eloquent word in Acts 17 while Paul's in Athens. He says, from one man, he's made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. So the scope. He's marked out their appointed times and history and the boundaries of their lands, where they live and when they live there. Why? God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. God's appointed the times in history and the boundaries of where they live so that they may seek him and find him. So when we see so many people on the move today, we have to say, people are on the move. God must be at work. Now, what do we do about that? Because diaspora missions alone will not fulfill the Great Commission, not pretending it will. But it is a powerful tool in God's hands, and we should recognize what God is doing as He's moving people across borders. We have to embrace this divine strategy unfolding in our time. And what it is it needs to be a strategy of both and. So this is an image borrowed from Global Gates. They've done an amazing job over the last 15 years engaging the diaspora. And not just engaging the diaspora, but seeing it go full circle. Because the gospel strategy among the diaspora isn't just about seeing immigrants reached or served in Jesus' name. It's about the glory of God among the nations. It's to be a contributor to seeing the unreached globally impacted with the gospel. So I won't go through all of this full circle, but ultimately we see God brings people to North America. That's happened. The church recognizes and trains and mobilizes workers to this opportunity. This is happening some. It has to happen so much more. Believers share the gospel and people come into the kingdom. Again, this is happening. It has to happen so much more. And then good news is meant to be shared. So once these people receive the good news, they share it with their family back home. And simultaneously, here they're being discipled in contextual ways. They're being trained to start groups in churches. And again, because of technology and ease of travel, they're working with family members, seeing them come to Christ and disciple their communities from afar. It's a both and strategy. Engaging the unreached in North America is a contribution to the Great Commission. So before we go any further, let me just frame my approach, and then I'll share with you my thesis, and then I'll just walk through some things to think through as you're beginning to strategize about a diaspora ministry focus. So I'm looking through the lens of unreached people groups no longer being reached through every means possible. So every means possible includes diaspora missions that reaches them here and then mobilizes the new believers to reach their communities in other parts of the world. They facilitate this. So that's my motivation. I'm looking at this through a people group lens. I'm working among urban diaspora unreached people groups. And so ethnic identity in cities becomes a focus of research. So my thesis is two-part. Urban migration often diffuses ethnic identity and weakens communal bonds. So that's the negative part, because we want to see ethnic identity maintained and communal bonds strengthened so the gospel can flow and penetrate. That's breaking down some in cities. But simultaneously, urban migration creates strategic gospel pathways into traditionally difficult to access and least responsive people groups. That's the positive. So we have to get that part right and trust God to work through all of this other messiness of weakened communal bonds. So that's my thesis. Now we're going to start to answer some of those questions I mentioned at the beginning. Who are the people? Where are they at? And how can they be reached? So the first thing I want you to look at is who are the people from largest populations? These 10 circles represent the largest 10 clusters of unreached people groups in North America. And if you're very familiar with people group identity, some of these names may not seem familiar to you. And that's because in the diaspora, typically what we see is people's identities get wider, meaning they go up a level whenever you think of hierarchy of identity. So someone who is someone in Pakistan, where there's hundreds of people groups and they speak Urdu, they're going to identify with their tribe, their people, their geography. Once they move outside their home country, just like you or I, whenever we travel somewhere internationally and someone asks us where we're from, it goes up a level. We don't talk about the street we're on or the city we're in. We may mention the state, but typically we're mentioning the country. So it doesn't change your identity, but it changes how you identify in those contexts. So that's what we're trying to capture here with these people group designations. But what you see is there's a lot of Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and Jewish peoples in large numbers in North America. And these groups have had limited exposure to the gospel in their home countries. Why? Because there's barriers of understanding and acceptance. But now God's brought them here, and our communities now host these diverse immigrant groups, traditionally unreached, and we can share the gospel with them. So UPG North America is a website that I helped start a couple years back. And so I'm no longer working with that project. But at that point, last I know, we had 373 unreached people group communities identified with populations of over 5,000 in North American metro areas. So notably in the United States, it ranks second among non-Muslim majority countries in receiving Muslim immigrants. That's just behind Germany. So that's increased significantly from about 4% in 1990 to about 7% of immigrants in 2020. Additionally, there's tons of people coming from Central Asia, South Asia, with about 4.6 million, or 10% of our total migrant population. 2.8 million people as of 2022 alone are from India. So that's the mission force. I'm sorry, that's the mission field, but God has also brought a mission force. Remarkably, 67% of immigrants to North America identify as Christian. That's a figure far higher than global migration trends, which is 47%. And so this presents a crucial missiological opportunity for the church in North America. So our role is going to extend beyond directly engaging least reached peoples, but also partnering with and empowering ethnic churches that share cultural affinities with these groups. So that's who are the people. Where are the people? 75% of all UPGs in North America are found in these following 10 cities. So I would say these 10 cities are high priority in mobilizing to the diaspora. And some of the key trends are 2021, 46.6% of people living in Greater Toronto area were immigrants. It's widespread urban presence, very few large pockets in rural areas. There's 52 urban centers across North America with at least one unreached people group of over 5,000 people. And then these 52 cities alone represent an unreached population of exceeding 8 million people. That's a mission field the size of a small nation right in our midst. And so the size of the community is actually important to consider in your strategy. So if we truly believe that the harvest is white, and then we need to be sowing the seed broadly to find people who are ready to respond to the good news. If you're mobilizing people to smaller communities, they typically don't so broadly for fear of breaking relationships with key community leaders. When you have large population pockets, you can share broadly and boldly, and you have many degrees of separation, different oikoses, different communities among that greater community that keep you separated. So outside of large major cities, we also see things in places like Bowling Green, Kentucky, where they have 5,000 Bosniaks. But other places that were kind of remarkable, but not necessarily expected. In St. Louis, Missouri, there's 70,000 Bosniak Muslims. In Nashville, over 20,000 Kurdish Muslims. And then in Columbus, Ohio, about 45,000 Somalis, second only in North America for a Somali population to Minneapolis. Now, beyond beyond urban areas in rural America, this also offers a unique access point where you can mobilize local churches. I wouldn't suggest mobilizing people to live there, but you could do some non-residential training in some of these areas. And this picture that you see here is meatpacking plants. It's not exhaustive, but typically whenever you find meatpacking plants, they're often staffed significantly by immigrant populations. Other places that you could look for is agricultural centers, logistics centers. They typically draw people who are recent arrivals to the United States. So what's happening in cities? Ultimately, we're seeing that migration disorients. Ultimately, people are losing language. Their cultural norms start to fade, but cities open up gospel access, digital tools, diaspora fellowships. And so ultimately, cities are leverage points. It's a place where God is rearranging the nations for our mission and his glory. So what happens in cities is also affecting ethnic identity. Ultimately, ethnic identity begins to lessen. So these enclaves that are dense, they can preserve language and customs, but ultimately goes up one level. People from Bangladesh, there may be people who are Sylheti and those who are Bengali Muslims. Once they're in New York City, they don't identify as much as Sylheti or Bengali Muslim. They identify as Bengali Muslim because that's the majority group. The other thing that we see is diaspora networks maintain ties to homeland. Each people group that I've ever interacted with has some sort of online chat or WhatsApp group where they stay engaged. You often early on in a resettlement of a people, within a few years, you start to see religious and cultural festivals start to come. That's a good way to identify groups. After generations, those become symbolic. Now, erosion of identity definitely happens because economic demands push them to language shift. It forces them to learn English, or if they're in French-speaking Canada, French. And what that does is it begins to erode their identity. Public institutions and diversity reduce traditional control. So like typically elders would make decisions for the community. Now they have to submit to governmental leaders. And then the youth ultimately adopt a hybrid identity or a more mainstream identity. Just one quick story. I was in Nashville working with one of the underground Kurdish believers, trying to encourage him to be sharing with the Kurdish community. And he was doing a little bit, but what I learned was his son, who moved here whenever he was 6, would go to downtown Nashville on Friday and Saturday nights, and he would share the gospel with just Americans. So we have this Kurdish believer who's generation 1.5 who really has nothing to do with his community, his Kurdish community. He views his community as the American church, and he's helping evangelize Americans. So it's that cultural shift that we begin to see. Fishman's model of generational change is something to consider as well. It kind of goes through generations. Generation one, language and traditions are typically remain. And then second generation, there becomes this tension and bilingualism. Third generation, the identity really becomes symbolic. Language is harder to keep together. This is what we're seeing in Somali families in Minneapolis right now. The elders who are nearing the end of their life, they're trying to maintain the norms, but the youth are navigating American identity. So why is this important to think about assimilation? It totally has to inform your strategy. You have to define the segment of people that you're trying to engage, not just Somalis, but your strategy is going to be different between first generation Somalis and second generation Somalis, or even generation 1.5. So understanding how they assimilate and then knowing how to read and research the people group that you're going to be engaging in the city is tremendously important, because what you can't do is you can't engage them like you would in the country of origin, right? Even first generation who's been here for 5 years, they've had some shifts. Similarly, you can't try to reach third generation or second generation the same way that you would reach just a regular American. So you have to understand, you have to be able to do a little bit of missiological thinking and contextualization. So similarly, when we're thinking about assimilation speed, class really informs the rate of assimilation. So the faster, the wealthier they are, the faster they're going to assimilate. The poorer they are, typically the slower they're going to assimilate. They're going to maintain ethnic identity longer. And this makes sense in a couple different ways. One, it's been observed clearly. But two, whenever someone is more wealthy, they begin to just embrace an individualistic view of life, which means they become isolated. And then their primary means of interaction is around work. And why? Because work's important, because it's what got them their wealth. And what do they need to do to stay wealthy? They work. Now, they may be sending remittances back to their home country, but they're not really connected back to their home country relationally in the same way. On the flip side, when they are living in poverty, they depend on each other greatly. There's not isolation. They are watching each other's kids. They're sharing meals. And so they assimilate slower and maintain that ethnic identity. Also, the new arrivals affects assimilation speed as well. If there's no new arrivals, they're assimilating faster. If there's a continued steady stream of new arrivals, slower assimilation. Why? Because every time someone new comes, they're greeted into the community and they begin to realize how much they've shifted away from their identity, and it brings them back. So new arrivals are actually anchors for culture and identity. And so again, mission strategy must consider the pace of migration to think, okay, what is good news to these people? How do I communicate the good news to these people? How do the people who receive the good news then be able to transfer it to someone else? Ultimately with a picture of saying, is this one of those bridges of God that gets us back to seeing the unreached in their home country reached? So class affects assimilation speed. The rate of new arrivals affects assimilation speed. The other thing that really has to be taken into account, if we're seeking to make disciples, plant churches, and see the unreached reached back in home country, we have to think about some of the other things that happen in cities in North America. Is typically these men and women who come here, they end up working 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours sometimes just to make ends meet. And when someone works that much, they don't have time to be discipled, to share the gospel, and host a house church in their home. But if you can find pockets of these people who are unemployed or underemployed, they have the availability to build relationships and have spiritual conversations. And it's not that we neglect the employed, but this becomes a bridge into that community, because once they come to faith, we can help them get a job. And then in the workplace, they can begin to make disciples. I'm speaking from we need the first few breakthrough believers among this people group in this place. Take into account the employment status of these people. Just another quick story. When the Afghans arrived in 2021, early on, all of these Afghan men had just time to spend. And then we shared the gospel and drank tea with so many Afghans. And within a few months, they were all working. And from a guy perspective, we didn't have a lot of people to meet with. The ladies were still at home taking care of the kids. So then it was trying to mobilize ladies from the local church to meet with these Afghan women, which had a larger language barrier, because a lot of the men, because they worked with the US government, spoke English. The women had a harder time using Google Translate and all of these things. I will mention that for many of the communities that are being engaged in North America, language learning is still important for generation one. I can't overstate that. Learning the language will endear your workers to the heart of the people. They will be able to communicate the gospel in a culturally relevant way. It will not seem foreign. And so that's one of the things that we've observed is fruitful workers in diaspora ministry. There's research called the Fruitful Practices research, specifically about Muslims. And those who have learned language and culture are so much more fruitful. Sometimes this includes going and living in the country of origin to be immersed in the language for 3 or 4 months as part of their language learning process. Now, a couple case studies. Wealthy South Asians. South Asians are everywhere across North America. Wealthy South Asians are affluent. They speak English. They spoke English before they got here. They studied here. They were fast assimilating. Now they have weak ties to rural Indian UPGs. They've lost some of that culture. They're potentially sending remittances back, but they're culturally growing distant. And so that's just an example of being more affluent and assimilating faster. Another case study is Latino immigrants in the US. Lower income communities retain Spanish much longer. And because of that, contextual gospel outreach in Spanish remains effective across generations. So, this is where Spanish ministry to these people is beneficial. Now, I'm not suggesting you develop a strategy for Latinos. I would rather say on the inverse, it's like a strategy to mobilize Latinos to the unreached, but just an example of assimilation. One that's really interesting is just 2 different locations in the United States of the Chinese diaspora in New York and California. So the community in New York is much more dense. It's maintained its ethnic retention for generations. It's typically a little bit more lower income, and they continue to get new arrivals versus California, which over the decades have spread out. It's older, it's more affluent, it's become suburban, and because of that, it's much more assimilated. And so why is this important? Again, because the gospel strategy must localize according to the context of the people in the place. And when you're engaging unreached peoples from around the world in a Western context, it's different. It's not existed anywhere in time before. And so it takes a missiological mind to look and observe these things. I'm just trying to share some principles that will help with that. And so let me begin to wrap up with this. What does this mean for strategy and resource allocation? You are representing a body that has a strategy and you have resources to allocate. You have member churches to mobilize. I would encourage you to prioritize those with the greatest need. Look at what's not being done among the unreached and see if you can step into that. Also, consider the population size of the people in the place. Consider the idea of partnering with close culture churches. So, like maybe you want to work with Yemeni Arabs. Could you possibly partner with an Egyptian Arab church to do that? And then find the place, the prioritization where you have a large Yemeni population and also some Egyptian or Lebanese Arab churches. The third thing to consider is utilizing a hot coal. So we're trying to bridge the here and there ministry. It's a both and so if you're building relationships with the work at large, which is the fourth thing, then you start to learn who are those fruitful practitioners from that people group. The hot coal is thinking about taking that person for a season, maybe it's 3 months or 6 months, and then dropping him or her into a new location. And so, like, what does a hot coal do? A hot coal can start a fire much quicker than flint and steel or rubbing wood sticks together. So it's like, what can happen quickly to get started? And like I mentioned, connect with the work at large. Start viewing the strategy as global, not just local. And then ultimately, my encouragement would be is to think catalytic. The way I define being catalytic is doing things that wouldn't happen unless you do them, but doing them in a way that they can continue without you, because we're all looking to see the gospel go among the nations. And for us to really see it spread, we can't hold on and control things, but we want to be catalytic and encouraging others to take steps of obedience to Christ. So some practical points. Engage existing communities. We're looking for glue that's already holding communities together and inserting the gospel. If you want to create a community to then insert the gospel, that takes a ton of energy. So I would encourage you to look for existing communities. Contextualize appropriately. So I'll let you decide what level that is, but language learning is important. Sometimes using majority religion terms to help explain the gospel is helpful. Sow the gospel broadly. Use social media campaigns. Use volunteer teams from churches to distribute resources or share the gospel. Your workers on site need to be findable to other missionaries. They need to be known, and they also need to be findable to the community they're trying to reach as being a spiritual person. Help your teams have clarity on the big picture of not just the here, but following it to there. It's imperative as God begins to give us fruit to empower emerging leaders at an appropriate level. And then this is key. This took me a while to learn is whatever you can do, always try to have your teams accept invitations to visit the home country. Sometimes you're invited for a wedding, for a feast, for all kinds of different things. Those are golden tickets. Do whatever you can to help grab those. Implement simple tools. Things don't need to be complicated, and refrain from enabling. So think like the book When Helping Hurts. We don't want to introduce something that the community itself should be doing. We want to maintain dignity. Some of these people have physical needs. I'm not going to go into that, but please balance that well and wisely. So let me close with this. Cities are strategic missional hubs. So if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis and the Narnia series, think of cities as wardrobes. They're places where you can enter and end up connected to someplace and someone on the other side of the world. Cities are gathering the nations. Our goal is to see people reached here so that they can reach their unreached homelands. So how can we best steward that in this place in this time? Let me just close the final thing with this idea of helping just churches, local churches, think of a pipeline to the ends of the earth. So let's say a church has adopted the Pashtun people and they have long-term workers among the Pashtun, or they don't yet. Think about mobilizing middle schoolers to Pashtun people in a city near the church. Like in Houston or Dallas or the Bay Area, there's all kinds of cities that have large Afghan communities. Find partners there and mobilize middle schoolers to do projects. And then the high schoolers, maybe to a larger city, a little bit further. Maybe it's New York City. And then college and young adults, maybe it's into a European city with Pashtuns. And then maybe it's your next step is sending a long-term worker, and just think of how much synergy that gives to local churches, that they know they're committed, they've adopted the Pashtun people, that they pray weekly for the Pashtun, that their middle schoolers are engaging, their high schoolers are engaging, their young adults are engaging, they have long-term workers. That's a church who's committed to a people, and they're asking the question, what is it going to take to reach Pashtuns? And then you can build a network of churches around that. And I just trust that God would use that in an amazing way. Let me pause here and just say thank you for letting me share with you. I hope this is beneficial. Make myself available to continue to interact with you, answer any questions you have. I covered a lot in a short period of time, so I apologize for maybe being incomplete or speeding through, but hopefully you get a picture of what God's doing and the opportunity he's given us today.